You're listening to the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tesla.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AI Native Dev. Today, we have a really exciting guest who I've known for the past 5-6 years now, and I've had amazing conversation with, and that's Tamar Yehoshua. Tamar, thanks for coming onto the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tamar is amazing in various ways and had an illustrious career, right? Maybe put some highlights from that sort of engineering and product leadership career, which include being a VP at Amazon or A9, being a VP at Google, notably on search as part of the journey, which is relevant to what you're doing today. You were Chief Product Officer at Slack, where we met because you also became a board member at Sneak at the time. And now you are the President of Products and Technology at Glean. Is that right? Am I missing anything important in the journey?
That's awesome. And the most important part was being on the board at Sneak, where I got to meet you.
Yeah, this was definitely fun highlights times on it, and got conversations that span well past the Sneak context. Today, as we get going, we'll talk about AI in the enterprise. We'll talk about building products with AI context. We'll talk about figuring out how to how to wrangle them in the first place. Maybe start us off by just explaining a little bit, what does Glean do?
So Glean is an enterprise AI platform. What we do is we read the content of all of your SaaS applications. We ingest information from Microsoft Office 365, from Google, from Slack, from Salesforce, from Jira, and make it easy to find information across all of your SaaS tools, and also to ask questions in natural language. So you can think of it as ChatGPT for your enterprise. In ChatGPT, you ask questions about the world. And in Glean, you can ask questions about your enterprise proprietary information within your enterprise. And we also have a platform that you can access all of this information. We call it the knowledge graph of your enterprise through our APIs, and have a platform also for building no-code applications. So anything that you want to do that's building AI on top of all of the information that's stored in all of these different SaaS apps, you can do through Glean.
Yeah, so super interesting, and the breadth here is also interesting. So you're, first of all, just clarification, is it more about discovering a piece of information that's scattered somewhere across the enterprise systems and linking to them, more kind of search orientation, or is it more around you actually processing and understanding those things and bringing back some summarized answer for it?
So both. So you can use it for both. So let's say I'm going on a customer call and I want to know who's the account executive for it. I can ask Glean really simply, who's the AE for this account, or who's the CSM. I can also ask, what were the latest outages? I can say, write me a brief, a customer brief for this meeting. And then it'll go through everything. It'll go through what were the latest meetings, what's the status of the account in Salesforce, what were the outages that I should know, and it'll put that together. I have to write the prompt that will put it together in the way that I want to consume it, and it will summarize that and give me the information. I do this often. Like any prospect, tell me about the prospect, what stage is it in, what should I know? Yeah. And now I don't have to have a CSM write a briefing for me. I can do it myself. So that's an example. So it does both. Of any kind of capabilities that ChatGPT would have, we can do through Glean. And we keep on adding functionality as well to be able to do better at summarization and insights.
Got it. So it sounds like it is primarily the ChatGPT, like you've used that analogy. So it's more the ChatGPT than the Google for your...
Yeah, so we have both interfaces. So we have an interface that looks like Google Search, but over your enterprise. So we have two different, the search interface and the chat interface. And then we have what we called AI answers. So think of Google introduced AI overviews recently, where you can get an AI overview in Slack. We have the equivalent of AI answers in the search interface. So that kind of brings them together as well. Yep. And then we also have the equivalent of custom GPTs that you can do on ChatGPT for a specific use case. Those are called Glean apps.
Got it. And they extend and personalize the, I guess, kind of the system prompts, or the ability to represent some subset of the enterprise data and in some form of interaction like ChatGPT.
Exactly. So a good example of a Glean app is most of our customers want to build an HR app. to say these are the canonical documents for HR, so that let's say somebody wrote an answer in a Slack channel to a question that was wrong, it wouldn't pick that up. But here are all the HR apps. So here's your knowledge base you should be looking at. Here's when it should trigger. Here's the kind of prompts that it should use, and it's specialized for that. And Glean will actually auto route. So if you ask a question in Glean and say, what's our vacation policy? It will auto route to the Glean app, the HR app. And then you can also, the HR team who build the Glean app can build actions to actually file your vacation through that Glean app. And what's nice about it is that it is no code. So an HR person who does not know how to code can build a Glean app.
Interesting. So I guess we'll come back to the building piece, because I think that's really interesting. The search angle of it, just to say, I guess maybe this is still the sneak DNA piece of it, but like immediately I get a little bit worried on the security front of that. It implies a system that is very knowledgeable, and you're telling me stuff about a client, but how do you know if I'm allowed to do that? And I think it's a thorny domain at the moment in the world of AI. I guess how do you think or handle compartmentalizing who should have access to what data?
So that was probably the most important thing that Glean did in the early days, is took security, privacy policies really seriously. So it didn't start by search and then we'll figure out the privacy later. It started privacy first from the get-go. So we have over 100 connectors to all your different SaaS apps, and we understand the privacy and governance of each app, and we understand the metadata that tells us, like for Slack, we know which channels are private, public, what are private DMs. For Google Docs, think of it, you've got a Google Doc. And let's say you share it with me with the permissions, anyone with the link can see it. But now my neighbor over here, you didn't share it with them. So they are not supposed to see it. Glean needs to know that I can see it, but they can't. And so how do we know that? We know because we can see your email and your Teams conversations and your Slack conversations. We can know if it was shared with you. If we don't see that it was shared with you, we don't let you have access to that. So we really understand the different policies for each of the SaaS apps, and we make sure that we abide by them. And it's very rigorous in what we do. But now, as you with your CISO mind, will say, wait a minute, maybe I don't want everyone in the organization to have access to all information that is not locked down, because there might be some people who created a document and didn't do the permissions right. It's security through obscurity. You never would have found that document, but now with Glean, you can find this. So I can say, when's the next riff? And if there happens to be a document about a riff that somebody in HR didn't get the permissions right, I would find it. So another thing that we've done is we have AI governance modules that we will enable a company before they launch to assess if they have documents that shouldn't be open. And we will flag certain types of documents for people to review. And we will enable a company to red list or green list. Like you can red list whole directories or whole types of documents to say, no matter what the permissions are, we never want these to show up in Glean.
Yeah. So how's be doubtful a little bit here for a second. So like in LLM world, when you feed the LLM knowledge, if the LLM understands or is aware of a riff, generally the perception in the security world is you can convince it to tell you. There isn't like the ability to, it's one thing to define the policy, which is a challenge in its own right, which I guess is easier for me to grok how you would do that. And also maybe a human will verify that and confirm it. But in the moment requests, who enforces these policies? And is it LLM? Is it the same Gen AI systems that know this? Or there?
No.
What's the secret sauce here? How is this compartmentalized in a more assured way?
So I have to explain the architecture more. So we do not fine-tune models with your enterprise data, because you're absolutely right. If you fine-tune a model with your enterprise data, or you do a large context window with all of the information, the LLM is just going to know that information. And that's why it's so hard to do this in the enterprise. So it is a RAG-based solution, and all of the enforcements are based on the retrieval part of RAG. So the way that the architecture works for the assistant in the natural language query, you put in a query in natural language. We call the LLM for the planning phase, where we take that query and we translate it into search queries. Then we create our retrieval engine and we get back the relevant snippet. So this is just search. It's
Yeah.
finding what are the right documents based on your permissions. And then that is the context window that's fed into the act phase. And now we call the LLMs in order to generate an answer. So that information, if you didn't have the right security for it to see the information, will never get fed into the LLM. And
Yeah.
so that's how we secure it and ensure it.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, and I think aligns with the best practice that I'm aware of in the world of security, which is you want to pull in the data from a bit more bread and butter systems, or I don't know, traditional systems, if you will, with authorization systems in which it says Tamar is allowed to see this and Guy is allowed to see that, and then you can massage and present and process that data in the right fashion for it.
And the other thing that people are very worried about the security in organizations is it really is sensitive because we are indexing all of your organization's data, is we actually allow people to host it in their own environment. So in their own GCP project or AWS project, so it doesn't leave their cloud premises.
So, what type of limitations do you need to take on because you don't train on the customer data? I mean, what could you do? And this is I'm thinking about this a little bit with the mindset of code, and I'm thinking indexing on your code base is a topic we've already discussed a few times in the podcast. And there's elements, all sorts of pros and cons to it. There's a certain amount of if you brought in bad code, you might replicate mistakes and things like that. But generally it's a scary proposition for a lot of organizations because they will be giving one of these giants access to their code and they're afraid, legitimately or otherwise, that their data will be there. But if you don't do that, there's a lot less, or at least my understanding is there's a lot less you could do in terms of feeding that insight of your code into the code generation. Is that true over here? What is
Yeah,
sacrificed?
I think the use cases are not as important in this case. So you could say, I want to make sure that all of the tone of any documentation or any marketing collateral, anything that comes out of Glean is consistent across everything that everyone is doing. So you can still have as input guidelines, and that can be part of your input. And so you can create a Glean app that says, here are guidelines of how we want it to be, but then the user is going to have to more explicitly do that and say follow these guidelines, as opposed to Glean understanding without the user telling them here's what I would like to do. But what I find is in those kind of cases, like marketing will say these are the marketing guidelines, or engineering will say here's the template for the design doc, and product will say here's how we follow the template for PRDs. So it isn't as much of a problem in practice because you don't ingest all the code and find the style of this organization. So
Yeah.
it's not as, it hasn't come up as an issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. It feels a little bit like you're not trying to regenerate things in the style of the data that you encounter. You're trying to find it and interpret it, but you're not trying to create a new customer record based on this conversation because of this, and therefore you want to have processed and digested all the previous customer records to doing it. You're trying to understand if you want to get a customer record in a standard fashion, then someone can build a Glean app that defines what is that fashion, how do you want to see that, and then you
Yeah,
can
and
find the right data to populate into it.
exactly. And that's going to become really interesting with the Glean apps of where are the ways that we can automate. So once you get actions, then you get much more automation, much more productivity savings because you can ingest all these things. So for example, you can ingest all of your Gong calls. So one thing that we built, the PM team at Glean built an app to look through Gong calls, tease out the information in the call, put it in a spreadsheet, and then be able to assess what are the most frequently asked requests from customers. So
Right.
like this is like multi-step, super interesting examples, but you don't need it all fed into an LLM, but it's more specific use cases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where things get like really interesting.
Yeah, no, I can see the power in it. And so, still a little bit on sort of the Glean journey, and we'll talk about the sausage making and how I guess we got a little bit into the sausage making here in architecture. Glean predates, I think, Gen AI, right? I think it was founded, and it was an AI company at the time as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what was before? Like what you're describing right now sounds a very Gen AI-ish company. Tell us a little bit about what was there before. Was this a pivot? Was this a natural expansion? How did that go about?
Yeah, so Glean started in 2019. It was founded by Arvind Jain. Arvind was an early Google search infrastructure engineer. So he was one of the people who built the original search infrastructure for Google search. I actually worked with him and Google back in the day in like
Yeah.
2011. So we know each other from
Almost.
there. And then he went on to Rubrik, where he was one of the co-founders of Rubrik. And then at Rubrik, as they were growing, he found that productivity decreased instead of increased, and a lot of it was around finding information. And by the way, we see that with our customers too. They come to us and they're like, if we've grown, we can't find the information we need to get our job done.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, why is there not a good enterprise search solution? So that's how it started, is building enterprise search. But because he came from Google, he knew that AI was being used in search at the time. Like BERT, the original models, the precursor to LLMs, were built by Google. Why? To improve search. So they had been used since I think 2016, 17 in search. The BERT models, vector embeddings, were used to improve the quality of search. So from the beginning, Glean was an AI search company. It was using BERT for its models. It was building vector embeddings before people were talking about vector databases. They fine-tune their own models per enterprise to build the vector embeddings. So this is why Glean's enterprise search was so much better than anything else on the market.
But this was search. It was Google search for your organization's
Exactly.
data. It was around AI the same way Google uses AI, which is I can connect the dots between whatever words that are actually similar. I can understand maybe a bit context. So like all of these vector databases, the embeddings
It
type
was for
solutions.
semantic matching.
So, got it. And I guess to an extent, he built what would have been the Google appliance that at some point came and went for the enterprise that connects all these dots. But it wasn't generating answers. It
Correct.
was
It was
pointing you
not,
to a source of information.
it was using AI as in ML. So it was using what was AI at the time, but it wasn't using generative AI. So it was just enterprise search. You put in a query, you find the documents. But it was a better enterprise search than anything else
Got
out there. The answers were just more relevant. Then and started selling as enterprise search.
it. And then how was the transition? Was it a sort of like run the alarm, ring the alarm, all hands on deck, we're switching to this sort of Gen AI thing? Was it a more gradual, let's try this out?
It was GPT-3 came out, and because we already had an AI team, people were keeping up with things, so it wasn't like a surprise, right? And GPT-3 came out and said we should have a natural language assistant interface into Glean. And there was a war room, get everyone together and build the assistant. And then it was build with the architecture that I described, it was put the generative aspect into the product. And then they'd already always sold enterprise search, and then they added on the assistant. And as you could buy either search or the assistant, now we're one product together. But it was a very fast pivot to let's add this assistant because now ChatGPT came out and every CIO was saying we need an AI solution. So then they can turn to Glean, and Glean has an assistant. It's an AI solution.
Right.
So it
Scratch
was,
the itch. Yeah.
exactly. I wouldn't say it was a pivot because all of the technology that was built for search was the R and RAG. It's the retrieval and RAG was Glean had a head start on everyone else because for 4 years had been building connectors, had understood privacy and security, and had built the retrieval engine because the exact same retrieval engine is what that was built for enterprise search is being used for the assistant.
Yeah. But it feels like a totally different user experience though, and almost a different positioning, right? What you've described right now wasn't, hey, we started with that's history. Now that's a piece of the puzzle, and the interface, the front door, the way you engage with the product is as a Gen AI product. Is that assistant
Yeah.
is the composition, not just finding the data, but most of the time it's less about sending me to the authoritative source and more about digesting what you found for me.
So we were going through this transition as everyone was starting to get used to ChatGPT and doing some searches on Google, some searches on ChatGPT or Perplexity or Bard/Gemini. And so it's the same thing. You can toggle between the interfaces in Glean. You can go to the search interface, you can go to the assistant interface. So yeah, it was another product built on top of the same foundation, because the foundation, how we deploy, how we secure, all of that stayed the same. So it was the user interface on top. And of course, marketing had to change and the messaging had to change and all of that. And there's a new team that's building the assistant. So yeah, it was an expansion, absolute expansion. And then more recently, about 6 months ago, we added the platform on it as well. So each of these are gradual expansions to the amount of functionality and capabilities.
Understood. And I think it's probably a good time to raise this. So I have this hypothesis that
Yeah.
I asked Des from Intercom as well in the previous episode, which is that when you think about AI, I oftentimes think about tools across these sort of two axes. I think about a trust axis and a change axis. So on
Okay.
one hand is how much does it ask me to change how I work? And on the other hand, how much do I need to trust it to get it right? So the more autonomous it is, the more I need to trust it to get it right. I'm going to put it, say, for example, in Finn, the intercom support agent, I need to put it in front of customers. I need to trust that it gets it right. I can spot check things, but I can't have a human verify the results. That defeats the whole purpose. And I guess my thesis is that if your product is already text-based, so it's already a search, it's already a chat, it's already, I guess chat has like the Slack version of chat, has the intercom version of chat, then at least the change vector, it's easier to introduce AI because I guess those are more naturally the way that you would interface, and it's easier to imagine a user on the other side. Does that sound right to you? I mean, you've seen Slack, you've been Google, you're now at Glean on it. Is it easier, or I guess in general, how hard is it for people to go from accepting you're going to point me to a link to somewhere else versus you'll summarize to me, or even just the interaction, the fact that they are in chat mode versus in search mode?
I believe that behavior change is hard. People just they're get used to doing things in a certain way. Even look at the retention numbers for ChatGPT. People try it, they play with it, and then they forget that they can use it because you're not used to using it. It's not in
Right.
your daily routine. Change is hard and it needs a lot of repetition. And while I agree that if you have a text interface, getting a chat interface on it because you're already talking in natural language, like with Slack, you're putting in messages and there with Glean, you're putting in queries. But the biggest stumbling block we have is people understanding what they can and can't do with it. So it's not that, okay, now I have a chat interface. It's what can I use this chat interface for?
Mm-hmm.
Search, if you think about it, when Google search first came out with queries, people didn't understand it either.
Right.
What's a query? Like now everybody knows what a query is, how to formulate a query, how to reformulate a query. You do a query, you don't get the results, you refactor it and you do it again. This is just like part of life and
Right.
people got used to it, but it wasn't that way in the beginning. You didn't know how to put a query in to get the right answer. So we're going through that phase with the assistant now, is that people come to the assistant and some people understand AI. They understand like the whole flow and like engineers understand how it's built. So they have the mental model of what it can and can't do. But then you put it out to people who have not interacted with chatbots before, with AI chat. And I'm not talking about customer support because customer support is such a different use case. It's like very small set of questions that people ask as opposed to universe is open. I can ask anything. So we have people coming to Glean and being like, what should my priority be for next week? Where there's no way Glean could know that information because it doesn't have the information.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't yet realize these are the questions that can be answered. So while I agree with you that transition is easier, when you go to the assistant, what you can do, what will work and what won't work. Like the example I gave you of the PMs creating this way to analyze gong calls, somebody outside of the product team at
Think
Glean,
about that as a possibility. Yeah.
yeah, they wouldn't even occur to them that they could do this. But as we get more used to this, and I contend as the next generation grows up with ChatGPT, and grows up with these products, it'll be like the generation that grew up with Google search. It'll become clearer and become more obvious, and the models will get better and they'll get stronger.
Yeah, interesting. I find the decision that Google has made to introduce the AI answers into the same interface, putting aside potential antitrust aspects to it, but from a UX perspective, is a great way to engage people on it, because they put in the search, they get a thing, they get some answer, and yeah, they can just scroll down and get what they are used to getting. But in the meantime, they've been exposed to that answer and they build those out. And I'm curious, Glean in theory could do the same thing, right? You could toggle, as you mentioned, between the interfaces, but you could also build something that's the same, that answers at the top.
We actually do have that. We have what we call AI answers. And we actually had it before the AI overviews at Google, but we do exactly that. We have an AI answer, and you can click more, and then it expands down and it'll get the full answer. And that is exactly that. We're careful on how often we trigger, because you want to make sure that it's going to be the
Only
right
if it's a good
intent.
answer, basically.
Yeah, because one of the challenges is when you go to search, you voice a query in a certain way, and when you go to the assistant, you voice it in a different way.
Right.
So there's also the expectation of the user and how they're communicating. So you get better quality assistant answers when you understand you're going to the assistant to chat. But we absolutely do that. And a lot of the engagement with the assistant is through the search interface and the AI answers that they get in the search interface. And we're going to be doing more of that, more of automatically triggering one or the other. I feel like in the future, there won't be these two interfaces. And the other thing that we do is that when you're in the assistant, we tell you which query we used to query the RAG, and we give you the documents that were accessed so that you can go back and you can click on those documents to go in. It's not only there's the citations, but there's also here's the list of documents that we used for the answer. So in a way, you're merging both directions. You're
Right.
making it easy to go from the assistant back to search, search to the assistant. So in a year, I think these all will get merged into one, and you won't have one or the other.
Yeah. It's interesting. I find a lot of compelling aspects to integration like this, because the user gets the choice and you get to interact with it. And I keep coming back a little bit to that limitations question, which is, I think, a bit hard to tell, and it depends on how well people build those policies. And I think it's also easier to accept that in the enterprise, even if the breadth of knowledge is bigger than just customer support, it is still vastly smaller than the whole web and that information. And so maybe it's okay to say that over here, the security and the element of controlling who can see what takes precedence, and you lose some neural connections that might have been made that would have been non-trivial if you had fed all this information into the LLM. But that's okay. That's a fair trade-off to make.
Yes.
So I guess let's talk. Indeed, I keep promising talking about the sausage making. Let's do that now. I guess
Okay.
what is it like building a product that works this way? The results of the product vary by the data that comes in. The success rates are very different, and that's on top of the fact that the LLMs move at such a kind of lightning pace, and so you get new models all the time. And if I understand correctly, you actually even don't pick the model. You have to work with models that the customer does. So
Mhm.
maybe tell us a little bit about how do you interact with the models, or just to set that. But what I'm really interested is, you talked about LLM as a judge. You had a post about this. Just how do you know that your product works?
It's very difficult. No, it's the non-deterministic aspect is the most interesting and challenging. My first week at Glean, I was talking to the head of the assistant quality team just to learn what do you do and how does it work, and realize that a lot of their time was spent talking to customers who did not have the right expectations of what it could do, or were complaining that it was non-deterministic. I did this query once, I did it again, and it didn't get the same thing. And we're starting to get used to ChatGPT and the concept of non-deterministic, but
Mm-hmm.
in an enterprise, you're a CIO, you buy software, you pay a lot of money for it, you expect it to have the same answer
Yeah.
every time. And so one is getting our customers comfortable with what LLMs can do and what the boundary conditions are is part of what we have to do in our product. And it can't just be in the marketing and in the enablement. You have to have some way in the product to take care of this as well, to understand what are the challenges going to be for people. So I explained the RAG architecture. So we have our way of evaluating the search, which most of the team came from Google search ranking, built eval tools just like Google search had. So that's like bread and butter. Like, how do you eval search? We have a whole process for
Yeah.
eval
This is
search.
not the user side. This is internal. This is
Correct.
to
This is
evaluate whether your search is working correctly with information the engineers see, your engineers.
This is our ranking. The ranking algorithms with a lot of information on exactly what was triggered and what
Yeah.
wasn't, and what scores it had. Now, it is a little bit more difficult because at Google, you could use third-party raters to say, here's a change we're making. Is this change good or bad? Evaluate it. But because this is enterprise data, we can't use third-party raters. We can only use our tools and engineers to look at the data. So that's another wrinkle on top for enterprise. But going back to your question of what's different is understanding the user mindset when they're using this product. How do you help them through that to give them guardrails so they can better understand what the product can do? And then how do you evaluate it?
Yeah.
And how do you make sure that it's working as intended with this new technology that nobody fully understands why it's giving the answer that it does?
Yeah. What are some examples of things that you would do in the product to help people understand this?
So a big one is suggest. One of the things about Glean is that we understand your organization. So in the connectors that we do, we also have a Workday connector, Active Directory, so we understand who you are, who are your peers, who's on your team. So we can suggest prompts that people in your team have been using. Oh, you're a PM. Here's a prompt from another PM that the things that they've been doing that you might want to try. And
Mhm.
so we can suggest, or generic suggestions. We've been experimenting with all different ones, but that can help guide people into areas of this is ways that you can get value. And that's going to be really important. And we want to do a lot more of that. And the Glean apps was a big way of doing that as well. Here's some more structured prompts and triggers. This is where, if you have an IT question, you'll go here. If you have want to build a customer brief, here's a Glean app for building a customer brief. So that helps people go to things that somebody has curated, somebody like the 5% of people in the company who really understand how to work with prompts and LLMs. They're going to do that and they're going to help. And we're
Right.
going to be doing more and more of that. And I hope that is a way, that's a whole nother angle of how we are doing that. And then we also have just teams dedicated to eval and understanding what changes need to be made, what don't, how to evaluate new models. As you mentioned, we customers can decide what model they want to use. We validate the model, we certify it, I should say. If a Gemini 1.5 Pro comes out, so we will certify it for our customers before we enable them to use it. But we have let our customers pick OpenAI, Anthropic, or Gemini for the LLM aspect of the work. And so that's another thing that's tricky also
Yeah.
is working with the different models.
But how? So I understand it like the suggest notion or the idea of disseminating. Actually, probably a useful practice for any product, not
Yeah.
an LLM specific one, which is take the forerunners and provide an easy way to disseminate their sample uses to the rest of the organization. But on the other side, in terms of what happens if it fails, what happens if hallucinations are a thing in this world. So ranges from it didn't okay, maybe you're good on the search side, so it finds the relevant data, you feel pretty good, but did it understand it? Did it process it correctly? Did it present it correctly? How do you evaluate it when you certify? What types of tools are at your disposal to know when you're using a new model or even just evolving your software that it got better
So
versus?
so first of all, in the product, customers can do a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Mhm.
Obviously, we get more thumbs down than thumbs up because that's just the nature of people.
Yeah,
But that's helpful until all those queries come back to us so that we know here's a set of bad queries. We also evaluate things like in search. It's easy. Did somebody click on it? Did they find what they were looking for? In Assistant, it's trickier because they might have gotten the answer or not gotten the answer. But for example, if they try a couple queries in Assistant and go to search afterwards and then find the document that they needed, we know that the assistant didn't give them the answer. So we have a metric, the
right.
satisfaction index from search in the assistant. So we look at that and we measure that very heavily of how many bad queries did we get, how many thumbs down did we get. So that's one
Yeah, and that's post
gross.
deployment. Those are all things that
Yeah,
basically you
that's the
observe people using the product
right. That's
once
the
you've rolled it out.
proxy for how well are we doing, and if we're doing hill climbing to improve, is it going up or going down? And then evaluating is super tricky. So we have, as you mentioned, we've started using LLM as a judge. And there are many ways that the LLM could go wrong, or the whole assistant could go wrong. It could pick the wrong query to send to the retrieval engine. The retrieval could not find the document. It could find the wrong one, or it could miss something. And then in the generative, not be a complete answer. It could not be grounded in the facts. It might pull in public data instead of the data that you had. And then, so you've got the completeness, the groundedness, and the factualness. So we've been using LLMs to judge our answers for the assistant in these different areas. So completeness is one that we get the most thumbs down. If it's not a complete answer, we'll get thumbs down for it. And then we've correlated the thumbs down with LLM as a judge and the completeness. So that's the most easiest for an LLM to then evaluate the results of the LLM.
Yeah.
And so we have completeness, we have grounded. Did it tell you which context it came from? And then the factualness is the hardest. And the factualness, what you need is a golden set, essentially.
Factualness being you did not hallucinate.
Grounded is more the hallucinations.
Okay.
We don't have a big problem with hallucinations at Glean because of the RAG-based architecture and because we do the citations. So the groundedness is the most aligned to hallucinations, but sometimes it's not grounded in an enterprise stock because it might be like the stock price that you ask for a company, and it might just be public knowledge. The factfulness is, LLMs are very confident. So they'll say with great confidence that something is correct. And then a user will not thumbs down those because they'll just assume it's correct. And those are the most dangerous.
Right.
And that what we're doing is trying to actually have a golden set. We're having an LLM extract queries from documents and then measure the effectiveness of, are we finding them? So we get the golden set, and then so this one, actually, we're still working on the fact how to best measure it. But the best part that we've done now is we have a repeatable process for LLM as judge. We have an eval framework of how we use, and we can just turn the crank when a new model comes out, and we can get an evaluation across these metrics for new models and for changes. As we're making changes in the code, we can evaluate them more easily. Is it perfect? No, but it's a lot better than engineers manually going and looking at every query.
And looking at the results. And that golden set needs to be created per customer?
So a lot of times we use our data for some of these golden sets to make sure, but we do have in our eval, we actually run queries in our customer environments, in their deployments, because we can't look at their content. But we can run things and evaluate them and get the results of the evaluation.
So that's interesting, and that's a good learning. So you can't look at their data. You have to make sure that your check did not cause problems with their data, or at least try to assess that's the case. So what you're agreeing with them is that you'd be able to run some processes that are not actually functional, or run a bunch of these tests on their platform with their data, but you won't access the data. You'll just get the results of like thumbs up, thumbs down. For a different version of the thumbs up, thumbs down to say, yeah, it feels good for you to deploy this new version, or to upgrade to this new model, etc.
We're very cautious of making sure we have very strict agreements of how we're handling customer data. But we absolutely run regressions, and it's an interesting process that we've gone through.
Yeah. And so we talk about LLM as a judge, which is the LLM looks at the answer and says, the result I see in the golden set seems sufficiently familiar, sufficiently similar to the result the live product gave right now. And then I found interesting in the blog post that you wrote about this. There's this notion of LLM jury, which I don't know, it has the risk of taking the analogy a bit too far. But I guess do you want to say a couple of words about that?
It's exactly what it sounds like. Just multiple, you want to assess not just one voice, but multiple voices to make sure that you're aligning.
And I guess partly a means to deal with the fact that LLMs themselves, like the evaluator itself, is a random or is a non-deterministic entity. So oddly, actually quite aligned to the reason there is a judge and jury in the actual human judicial system.
That's a good point. Yeah, because people are non-deterministic too.
Yeah. It's like it's built in our image, and versus maybe non-enterprise or a consumer version of it. But are there other highlights? I think the things I captured so far have been the fact that you have to use their model. You can't necessarily see their data, maybe even the fundamental architecture of being RAG based, because you're going to be dealing with sensitive data. I guess what other things jump to mind in terms of the difference between building a ChatGPT for everybody and a ChatGPT for the enterprise?
The biggest one is the one you cited for ChatGPT. For consumers, it's run off the internet where everything is public knowledge. So you never have to worry about permissions. But the other thing is when you're building search for consumer versus enterprise, the signals that you use for ranking are different. So in consumer search, you have a lot of click signals because you have millions, maybe billions of people using it. So it's very dense, your click signals. And your like semantic similarities, your synonyms, you just have a lot more data to go on. So the kind of signals you get in the enterprise, you're not going to get the anchors that you have in search, the density of click. They're very sparse. Your click data in the enterprise is too sparse to use that. But then you have different data. You have activity data. You have, oh, this document, like a lot of people are looking at this document in the last week, so it must be important, so let's bump it up. You have the what I talked about of knowing your team. If I'm looking for an onboarding document for my team, I'm not going to use one from marketing. I'm going to use one from somebody else in engineering or somebody in my team as a template to start from. So that's a signal that has no meaning in consumer, but is very important in the enterprise. Things like activity and proximity, like how proximity of the person looking at
Right.
the document, what is their proximity to me? So personalization is a very strong signal in Glean for doing ranking, which it's a much weaker signal in consumer. So that is what the team spent the first couple of years figuring out, is what are the enterprise signals that you need for ranking.
Yeah, and the whole architecture predicates on the fact that the first problem is find the relevant pieces of information in the enterprise, and then subsequently, as we've discussed before, the Gen AI UX on top of them is how you interact with that data versus
Yeah.
pointing it elsewhere, which opens up its own set of opportunities and at the same time maybe challenges around adoption because it's a new practice. And I guess what is your sense around enterprises' readiness to embrace all this new stuff on it? Are they chomping at the bit to take it? Are they trying to stay away and just do the minimal whatever board requirement to do the AI? You
So
feel
they're more ready than I thought. Like CIOs are like, we need an AI solution, and they're all going out there and evaluating different AI solutions. Now, part of it is a checkbox because the board is telling them they need an AI solution, but there's a lot who are genuinely interested and genuinely curious. I mean, you see a lot of IT departments in large companies using OpenAI to try and build their own solutions. And a lot of come to us a year later and we tried to build this. It's hard. Didn't realize how hard RAG is. We should use your APIs. So I do think that there is a willingness. There's also some fear. So some companies are like, even if you say you're secure, I just don't want any AI coming anywhere near me. And those we don't even talk to. But I have been encouraged by how many want to bring it in. And then after they bring it in, you have the champions who really are like vocal and figure out how to use it. That's what's going to take biggest change management, is how do you really educate everyone on how much they can make their jobs better, how much they can leverage products like Glean to be more productive. Because as I said with the ChatGPT example, people just forget sometimes and just don't
right.
even think of
Yeah. And humans change the slowest.
it.
So that's a good tee up to the final question here. Is we talked about the 0 to 1. How do people even wrap their heads around what is it that they could do? What do you imagine as the far down the road reality? I talk about AI native software development, talk about AI native in a bunch of things. What is the AI native reality? I don't know if that's the right term here for enterprise search, for Glean's vision.
I think that people are going to be able to automate away a lot of what they do today, a lot of the toil that they do today. And if you think of some people, executives have assistants, you'll have essentially an assistant for every aspect of what you do. And you're not going to have to do a lot of this, like writing the first versions of your documents, prepping for your customers. We had a finance person build a Glean prompt to help her figure out comp for salespeople, read the spreadsheet and understand for which salesperson is getting what comp based on what they've done. Like all these things people are doing manually, and people will just get used to. It'll be a new thing. They'll even forget when they used to have to do it manually. And that'll be okay because they don't need that skill anymore. And they can spend time on other things, other hopefully more creative, higher leverage things. I'm looking forward to that day.
Yeah. And is it safe? It sounds compelling for sure. And I guess you and I have both been in sort of leadership positions, and so sometimes spoiled with having some of that work happen with others on the team. Do you find that to be a good mental model? Is it like everybody would be a bit more senior in their org with having a whole bunch of helpers around them, and the type of work the average person or whatever, even the more sort of lower down the hierarchy of an organization would be doing would end up being more senior compared to what we're doing today, more managerial?
I've heard somebody describe it as it's like having teams of interns. And so I wouldn't put it as everyone will be more managerially. I don't believe that. But I believe if you had interns who could do a lot of the rote automated work that can easily be automated, so
Right.
you can do the creative work. And so I think you will get more productivity if everybody had this 5 or 6 interns to go build this code here, build that document there, that presentation. I think we'd all be, I think, happier in how we're spending our time.
Yeah. Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. Tamar, this has been excellent. I'm sure we could go on for a full extra hour to dig into it, but thanks a lot for coming on the show and sharing a whole bunch of these learnings.
Thank you for having me. It's always great to talk to you.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time on the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tesla.